The small house policy is the right of the son of an indigenous villager to build a house on his land. It was a policy that was put in place in the 70s in response to upheavals in Hong Kong, and the desire of the UK government, the colonial government at that time, to placate the New Territories villagers, who were a lot better living in very poor conditions, and it was also a hotbed for communism at the time. So this was really kind of a welfare policy. The original idea probably made sense that the indigenous villagers had a right to build a house. But by now, it's an economic development opportunity for the landowners, for the villagers who had an original right to that paddy field that were farming it in the old days. And for them, it's a way of making some money. They don't have to pay land premiums unless they sell it within 5 years. So what they do is they build it up, they rent it out, and then they sell it. And for them, it's a way of making money. It's basically a free grant available to the rural villages, which is not available to the urban residents of Hong Kong.
Because we have a small house policy, which is a law, indigenous people, they should be allowed to continue with their tradition, which is to build a house for a male descendant. I think that should be allowed. But the problem is now the small house policy is abused. The male indigenous villagers, he sells his right to the developers, and then the developers gathers up maybe, I don't know, 60 rights, thing rights, and then he builds 60 houses, which is completely against the intent, the small house policy. That's not what it's supposed to be, but it is what it is now. In the long term, I think the small house policy must be abolished, or should be abolished, because if you compare an indigenous and a non-indigenous person, the indigenous person has the right to build this house. Right now, just let's take some numbers. An indigenous could build a house like this for maybe 1.5 million Hong Kong, and then he can sell it in the market maybe for 10 million. Now, for a non-indigenous person, he doesn't have that right. Now, you can argue that because he could sell it for 10 million, he's got a mate for life. He doesn't have to do anything else. Whereas for a non-indigenous, he struggles all his life just to pay down his mortgage. And that, to me, is a grossly unfair thing in our society. And I think because of that, it has to go. But realistically, because it's enshrined in the law right now, Hong Kong, I don't know how much you know about it, but there was, when it was handed back to China in 1997, there was a commitment of saying that there will be no major changes in 50 years. So I think a lot of people are thinking that, okay, we'll keep the small house policy for 50 years, but after that it has to go. But before then, I think the general consensus that somehow we still have to respect the law, the unfair law which gave this advantage to the indigenous population.
The policy was originally meant to provide villagers who lived in the village with a house to live in. And traditionally, the practice of the villages was once a young man who grew up here became 18, or he got married, effectively, he had a right to build a house. And so the government sort of transmuted that into a small house policy And one of the purposes of the policy was to make sure at least that they built their houses according to some safe standards. But it was also another means to solve the housing shortage at that time in the villages, when indigenous villages were almost all the people who lived there. Now that's not the case. It's completely changed. And so where's the logic in a person who lives in Manchester and works there being able to build a house here that he's only ever going to rent or sell to someone else? Why build houses? I mean, there are thousands of these people out there. I mean, the Haeungi Cook itself estimates there are over 200,000 of them around the world. Just an unfair policy. And plus, it's the small house policy is the most environmentally destructive source of development in the New Territories. And although we may not be able to do much about it in large towns like Yuen Long and Sha Tin, when you're dealing with national parks, this is like saying, let's put a housing estate in the middle of Central Park, New York, or turn the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco into housing. What do you think the people there would say? There'd be uproar. And I think even in Moscow, which has many parks, I think even the people there would start complaining if this sort of thing was going on there. So it's a question of building awareness, and we in our groups, the Save Our Country Parks Alliance, we're simply concerned with saving as much of our natural environment as possible and stopping inappropriate and incompatible development going on inside our national parks, because it doesn't fit. They don't go together. So I think the position of the indigenous villages and their governing body, the Haeungi Cook, and that of conservationists is irreconcilable at the moment. They just want the housing and make the money, and they don't care about environmentalism or conservation. So there is a total disagreement on this at the moment.
嗱，蠔涌咧其實有一個即係我所講嘅中度發展嘅地方啦。其實佢現時所起嘅丁屋係好多，但係將來已經係好難揾到地再去起啦。其實都已經係受咗一定嘅限制，將來係冇辦法再去擴展佢哋嘅地方。呢啲就係中度發展面對嘅問題啊。就偏遠嘅咧，就算批到俾你，你都唔會去起，因為太遠啦，冇個需求，冇人去住，亦都個材料費太貴，建築費太貴，起到亦都冇一個價值去做。咁所以其實就香港呢個鄉村屋咧，其實漸就係差唔多係凍結咗喺某一個階段。所以其實就話有啲人話講到話好乜嘢話就不斷嘅擴展啦，其實呢個唔係事實嚟嘅，因為喺規劃部門亦都規劃咗每條村有個叫 V 松啊 ，V 松之內你哋可以申請 ，V 松外咧你都可以申請，但係批嘅機會咧係微乎其微㗎啦，係好難批㗎啦，冇得批咁滯㗎啦嚇。所以其實公眾亦都唔需要太擔心呢個情況嘅發展嘅。就其實每條村都有個 V 松擴展嘅，鄉議局原則上會支持嘅，因為呢啲都係當地村民嘅權益嚟嘅。當然佢嗰個主觀願望去擴展係一個問題，客觀事實俾佢唔擴展到，亦都係另外一個問題嚇。因為呢啲申請個 V 松全部要去城市規劃委員會去通過，但係城市規劃會有一定嘅法定程序，好多人都喺度睇實呢個城規會嗰個發展，所以亦都好多意見翻嚟，咁就喺嗰度咧會有一個好強嗰個大家去申述啦，申述咗點就城規會要有個決定，咁所以客觀上咧係唔容易做得到嘅。
I cannot say a very certain comment on where or how the policy has to be changed, but it is a must for us to review it and also have a consultation with all the people to talk about small house policy. We cannot stop here, is what I can be sure, but how and where is another problem I think we have to do together. For me, of course, I think we have to, because I'm the youngster, doesn't have a house, and then I living in a public housing estate, and I have no salary, and then so I think small house policy occupy too much land, and then if it turn into another like the youngster hostel, maybe I can get my own house, something like that. But it's as personal. But for you mean it is a policy, it's a public issue. You have to discuss at least among this office and among my friends and my parents and everyone, the whole Hong Kong, the Hong Kong residents. Because I always think that the policy will influence everyone, even though small house policy, I always say that is the indigenous issue, it's not the others issue, but it's not. You always affect everyone, and then so for me, the most urgent thing now is how we start the discussion and how I can invite people to do the discussion together.